I've looked at a dozen videos about soldering on gas tanks, and almost all of them are wrong or dangerous in one or more aspects. So we'll look at the right way to do that today. The biggest single mistake I see on all of these videos about people trying to solder holes in their tanks is they don't know how to solder properly. You have to get the metal clean and put flux on it, and you have to heat the metal until it is hot enough to melt the solder when the solder touches the metal. If you use the torch or the gun to melt the solder onto the cold metal, it will not adhere properly, and you'll have a cold joint which can pop off and just start dumping raw gasoline on top of your motor, and that's a recipe for an exploding motorcycle. So, don't make cold solder joints. Heat the metal until it's hot enough to melt the solder when you touch the solder to it. If it's not hot enough to do that, keep heating it. You can't do it with a wimpy little 30-watt pencil soldering iron. You need something hot enough to get it hot fast so that you're not putting heat on it endlessly. This metal will conduct heat away from here. So if you use a little tiny thing, it's going to be sucking the heat away forever and ever and ever. But if you use a big soldering iron or a torch, even a small propane torch, you can heat it up fast and get the work done quickly. If you're doing this properly, it only takes a couple of minutes. If it's taking a long time and you're building cold solder on top of cold solder, you're doing it wrong. Right, this gas tank was cleaned out with solvent, and then it was cleaned out with soap and water, and then it was etched with phosphoric acid, and that was neutralized with baking soda and water, and then it was rinsed with lots of water, and then it was cleaned with evaporust, and then it was rinsed out with soap and water and rinsed with plain water and put on a heater and dried bone dry. So there is no risk of this tank exploding when I use a torch on it. But if you're going to try to repair your tank without prepping it very much, empty the gas and wash it with dish soap and hot water and rinse it out and let it sit so that you get the gas fumes out of it. And then if you work with a soldering iron or a soldering copper, the solid copper thing you put on a heat with a flame, you don't have any risk of blowing yourself up, but you can use a torch on it too. Do not take chances. Somebody, idiot on the internet, suggested that you use the exhaust from a car to try to keep one of these tanks from blowing up. You'll kill yourself if you do that. Cars spew out raw gas out the tailpipe. You put that in a tank and then put a flame on it, you'll blow yourself to hell. Don't do it. Okay, getting this prepped is important And knowing what you're dealing with is important too. This tank is galvanized on the inside, and I assume that it's galvanized on the outside. Galvanized metal is not easy to solder to. The quickest and best way is to remove the galvanizing and get down to the steel. But if you're going to try to solder to galvanized, you want to use a good acid flux that's made for that, like this one. And if you can silver solder, so much the better, but you don't have to. If you can't follow safety precautions, if you haven't got these tools, use some JB weld and just get over it. It won't kill anything. You can always grind that off and solder it later. If you've got a hole, a pinhole, the metal surrounding this on the inside is paper thin. You want to drill this out some so you get the solidest metal that you can. And if you've got a very big hole, it's better to put a metal patch over it and sweat solder that in place than it is to try to just fill the hole with solder, which is not the strongest stuff in the world. Get a thin steel washer and just cut it in half. So you make a little patch that'll go across there with solid metal. Get this all clean, get your flux on there, and solder that patch on there, and you'll have a good strong repair that'll last. Now the question that arises, how are you going to get the paint off of here? You get three options. I would not use a chemical stripper because it's going to get inside the tank and make life a mess. You can use a heat gun and try to mask off the area you don't want to mess up, and use a heat gun and scrape the paint off, and then use emery cloth or a wire brush or something after that. You can use a very aggressive wire brush and just grind it off. But remember, this metal is thin. This metal is very thin, and you don't want to use a grinding wheel or some stupid thing like that. You'll end up with a hole big enough to put your thumb in. So I'm going to try to find my heat gun, mask this off, try to bubble this paint off, and if I can't do that, then I'm going to use a wire brush or something. Okay, take your washer that you're going to use for a patch and clean it up. If it's got plating on it, probably best to take the plating off. You want all nice and shiny and bright and clean. This is the unpolished side, and that's the polished side. This is a diamond diamond abrasive pad, but you can use something like this. You can use emery cloth. You can use a file. You can use a grinder, a wire brush, whatever you got. Okay, take a little bit of solvent like acetone, and I mean a little bit, and put it on a paper towel and clean this surface and around here so that you get rid of any last bit of paint residue, oil, grit, dirt, dust from sanding, anything. And going to use that same stuff and clean this washer that you're going to solder to. Don't slop that stuff around. You don't want any explosive mixture around if you're going to use a torch on this thing. Just use a little bit to get the surface squeaky clean. And take your acetone and put it 5 or 10 feet away from where you're working. And take your little solvent rag and put it outside the shop so that there's no fumes. And it's good to have ventilation when you do this anyway, because you're going to be heating acid and it's going to be making fumes, and yeah, so that's how that is. So the next thing we're going to do is take and cut this little washer in half so we can have two patches. Okay, gravity's not your friend, so get your tank blocked up in such a way that you've got a surface that's pretty flat so that you're not trying to hold these things in position. And put your little patches where they're going to go in there. You can see that there's some dimpling in this metal, And there's not much we can do about that except let the solder fill that, and that's okay. If you gotta get really fancy, you can try to take your little ball peen hammer and bend this washer so that it fits better, and there's nothing wrong with that at all. It got some curvature in it when it got cut, so just let that work for you. It's not critical. The solder will follow the flux. So if you have plenty of flux on there and you've got this surface good and hot, the solder will suck up underneath these things called sweat soldering and fill any voids and bond well. So the prep is everything, and having enough heat is the next thing, because as I said before, the proper way to solder is to get the work hot enough so that when you touch the solder to the metal, the solder melts and it follows the flux around and fills all the voids. If you're using the flame or the soldering iron to melt the solder and try to flow it onto the work, you will not get a good bond. You'll get a cold solder joint. It will not be reliable. It will fail. And of course that means raw gas draining on top of your motor and blowing you up. You don't want that. So get the work hot. Get the solder to melt by touching it to the metal. Have plenty of flux on there, and it will do its job, and it'll only take a minute or two. And as you'll see, a minute or two really is like, 20 seconds. Okay, you have two options at this point. And if you're not experienced at soldering and you don't trust the reliability of what you're about to do, it's okay to do what they call tinning the metal. And in that case, what you do is you put flux all over this and get it hot and melt solder on there so you have a thin coating of solder on here so that you know you've got a good bond. Then you can put more flux on top of it, put your patch on top, and heat it up again. And you won't have to apply very much solder, perhaps none, but just a little bit of solder, and you'll be sure that you have a good bond. It means heating the work twice, and if there's a chance of damaging the paint or there's other considerations, you may not want to do that. But if you have plenty of heat available and it's good and clean, there's nothing wrong with doing that. I think maybe I'll do that here because I want to show you what it looks like when the work is hot and the solder melts onto the work. And if I get a pair of needle nose pliers, I think I can lay those patches on there while it's hot. Okay. I used a little of this tinner's fluid to on the surface of those the washers that I'm using for patches, and I'm also using it on this area that I'm going to solder to. A little bit of acid, and then I'm going to use some acid paste flux. Now I should have a brush, but I don't have it, so I'm going to apply it with a paper towel. I'm getting it all over my fingers. Kind of a pain in the ass. Turn this camera off for a minute. Okay, remember this stuff is acid based. It's corrosive, so careful what you do with this stuff. After you get done doing all this soldering, you got to clean this crap out. And If it gets in the tank, you've got to clean it out of there too. Okay, what I'm doing now is putting flux on these patches so that when I pick them up with a needle nose and stick them on there, they're going to be gooped already. Because the work is going to be hot and it's not going to be easy to stick my fingers in there or anything else. Alright, so that stuff is kind of nasty, very sticky. If you got rubber gloves, well, use them. Anyway, so now we've got the two patches ready. We've got flux on there. I probably should have more flux on there. I probably can't have too much of this stuff because you can clean it off later, but you certainly can have too little. If you don't have enough of it, your solder's not going to flow and it's not going to adhere. The purpose of the flux is to keep the surface of the metal from oxidizing under all this heat that you're applying to it, so that the solder can bond to the metal. Now there's lots of different kinds of solder, and I'm going to try to this is 4060. Part 10, and I can't tell what the other part is. Doesn't really matter. Okay, now this camera's kind of in my way. I guess I can do this. You're probably going to see my shoulder. Hope I don't run out of gas here. Okay, so what I'm going to do is heat this up until the solder will melt on the metal. Try to get it tinned, and then quick like a bunny try to get those patches on there. You see that the flux liquefies right away. You can see that I'm not having any trouble getting the solder to melt. The metal is very thin, and so it didn't take a lot of heat. I could have done this with a big soldering iron. I'm happier with the torch, I really am. Because I like to have it happen fast like that. What have I done with my solder? I like to have it happen fast like that. Now you can see the solder being sucked up right underneath the patches. Get there. Difficult to position these things. I'm not at all sure about this one. Now when that surface gets granular like that, that's an indication of a cold solder joint. You need a nice, silvery, smooth surface. If you don't have a silvery, smooth surface, you do not have a good joint. Okay, there's a lot of excess solder in there, and I'm actually going to wipe some of this puddle away here because we don't need that in there. All right. Well, it's not beautiful, but it's also not going to leak. See if we can. You can't really see what we're seeing in here. An awful lot more solder in there than we need. But the point is that that is well bonded, and the washers are what's sealing the hole. You're not relying on the solder. So I think there we go. When that cools off, I can use rubbing alcohol or probably just as good a thing as any to get all that extra flux and stuff off of there, and follow that with some soap and water. See these puddles? Those are puddles of acid flux, and it'll actually cause the metal to corrode eventually. So after this is cleaned up, I'll spray it with cold galvanizing paint, because we've got some raw metal there, and then a top coat maybe of yellow paint if I bother. But there we go. No cold solder joint, and that's the point. If you don't get anything else out of this, heat the metal until it melts the solder. Anything else is bullshit. So there's our repair. And I took rubbing alcohol and got all the acid flux and slag off of there. And I think you can see that it's nicely sealed, strong, good adhesion, and nothing crusty and indicative of a cold solder joint. That's there for the life of the tank. So what we'll do now is we'll coat the inside of the tank, which is why we were doing all that prep to begin with. But any other spots that might have eventually become pinholes will be sealed by the tank sealer, and I don't think we're going to have to worry about those in the future. So I think this is as good a repair as you can get. And you know, if you're on the side of the road in Africa or South America, you're going to do what you have to do. Probably slap some JB Weld on there and keep going. But I'm 77. I'm not going to keep this motorcycle more than a couple more years before I have to quit riding. So when I sell this to somebody, I don't want to sell them a crock of shit. I want to sell them something that's had a good repair. There it is, with the tank all cleaned up, a little simple green, and all the crud off. So I think I'll take and hit that with a little bit of cold galvanizing paint, and then a little bit of yellow paint, and we'll be good. Yellow paint alone probably be enough.